Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fales Library. I'm Marvin Taylor, the director of the Fales Library, and on behalf of the NYU Libraries and Dean Carol Mandel, I'd like to welcome you to another of our critical topics in food. This is the first of the 2007 series, and today's topic is Cooking with Color, World Influences in American Foodways. And I'd like to make a special thanks to Peter Mondavi for his support of this year's 2007 Foods Critical Topics in Food series. With a generous donation, he's also provided his new organic wines for all of us to drink. So thank you very much, Peter, for your ongoing support. I have a few updates on the collection, the Food Studies collection here. I checked today to see how many titles we have. We have so far cataloged 11,926 titles. With Dahlia Carmel's collection of 8,500 titles, this is going to bring us up to somewhere around 20,000 titles in a record 4 years, which moves us up there with the top 3 or 4 collections in the country. And so we've surpassed the Schlesinger at this point. So, so at any rate. It continues to grow, and thank you all for your support and for your generous donations to the collection. There's one person without whom the Critical Topics in Food series would not take place, and that's Clark Wolf, who's the president of Clark Wolf Company and the impresario behind much that we do here. Please join me in welcoming Clark, who's going to moderate today's panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope you're all warm and cozy. We were going to have lap blankets for you, but we thought better of it. Today's topic is really very interesting. It happened after a series of conversations. I was on KNPR, National Public Radio in Nevada, in Las Vegas, in the middle of nowhere. And the doyen of the local food scene said to me on the air, "I'd love to take you to some of our fabulous little ethnic restaurants. They're so good and they're so cheap." And I'm on the air. And I said, "Well, you know, I'd love to go to some of your local restaurants, but I really don't like that word. It's really kind of derisive. It's really kind of negative." She said, "Well, then, dear, how would you like the term exotic?" And I said, "That's worse." I said, "Why don't we call them international? Why don't you call the Indian one an Indian restaurant, and the Mexican one a Mexican restaurant, and the African one, depending on where it's from in Africa, what it is?" And we began to think about it, and we quickly got off the air. Oddly, I have not been asked back. In the course of conversation with one of my good friends, Marcus Samuelsson, he was discussing with me a couple of things. One of them was that he was putting together the first ever, think about this, the first ever Ebony All-Black Chef Gala event. I went recently. It was an extraordinarily good event, especially for a group that had never done it before. You know, these things take time to gel, because Lord knows we've all been involved with a lot of them. I couldn't believe it was the first ever. It was last fall, 2006. And I asked Marcus not long before that what he thought of the piece, forgive me, in the New York Times about black chefs. And he said, well, I'm paraphrasing. I don't want to quote you. I'll let you do that on your own. "I hated it." He said, "I called the editor and complained that it wasn't really very well done and it was superficial and it was wrong. And by the way, they didn't talk to Jessica." So we are here today. I want to mention a couple of people.
Every one of us.
Yeah, we asked them to please take the subway and leave the windows open. But before we get started, I just want to get this in your brain to get, germinating. First of all, I want to acknowledge a couple of friends in the group, in the family. Acting Chair of the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health, Amy Bentley is there. Welcome, Amy. Thank you for being here. I don't know, it's the moon or something. Everybody's so busy this week. It's kind of nuts. I also want to welcome back our mentor, our pal, Dr. Mary Nessel, who has been out in California working with some Michael Pollan guy at Cal. Welcome back, Marion. Thank you for coming back. Marion will give you her synopsis of the Michael Pollan-John Mackey debate at Cal, not for attribution. Anyway, I want to tell you about the 2 coming dates and one other special event. The 2 coming dates are June 14th, and that topic is evolving, but it is called Building a Food Professional Pedigree, The New Roads to Success. It used to be that you went to Lausanne or Cornell, you went to France, you went to Italy, you went to Switzerland. Now, to build your pedigree, to build your resume, you might go to Shanghai, to Singapore, to South America, to New Zealand to Australia to Las Vegas, to Western Sonoma, or to Brooklyn. All of them are good. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that's working. So far on our docket, Dr. Nessel, Mary Nessel, will be giving us an update of all the academic programs and associated programs, or many of them, throughout the world that she has discovered, and what she thinks they mean to the mix. Write that down. We are going to be joined by somebody fresh from a career pause, a woman called Laura Cunningham, who for the last 16 years has been the organizational and front of Thomas Keller's restaurants. And we're going to talk to her about how that has evolved in the last 20 years as she's been working in that field at the very top of the American culinary game. And we're going to be joined by Florence Fabricant, who isn't supposed to come to these things, but reports on them, and in her off-the-menu column for the last 20-some years, has given a pedigree to chefs and restaurateurs that always consisted of specific code words that were acceptable to the readership. She's going to talk about how that's changed. Now, I'm looking for a male chef, because as you may have noticed, all those people are women on that team so far, who has a non-traditional trajectory professionally. And I'm having some trouble. So if you have, all right, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it off the record. Now, also on your seats, or actually under your seats right now, you have a couple of things. One is a kind of a questionnaire about the library and what we might do better to serve you. Another is a 3x5 card that has been supersized to a 5x8 card, right? We always say 3x5 cards, it's a euphemism. That's for your questions. We like to have people ask questions, but we've come to hear them. So if you will write your questions down in the course of the conversation and pass them up when we call for them, I'll be happy to edit them politely and make sure they get asked. In October will be our third Critical Topic Series panel, and that will be called Chefs Who Grow Their Own. It is really about the growing connection between the actual dirt, the making of the food, the origin of the food, and the people cooking it. And at that time, Marion Burroughs will join us on that panel, as will Joseph Bastianich, who is a restaurateur and winemaker, as will others. That will lead into a very special day that will be invitation only. Many of you will be invited to come, particularly if you sign up today. It's something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time, something that Marion Nessel and I have been talking about in various forums, and something that Marvin Taylor, our curator, feels is timely. And that is a day and a half symposium on these critical topics in a bigger picture. There'll be a component about libraries and collections. There'll be a component about educational activities and how they're evolving. There will be a component about initiatives and organizations and how they are having an impact on the world of education and vice versa. And there will be about at least one sizable chunk about the new forms of expression, not just an insert of eloquent writing in the gourmet summer issue, but film and, Lord knows, evolving television and downloaded video wahoos, all about food in very many forms. Blogs are us. So that should be a fascinating day. There will be people invited from all over the country, and we do have some funding already, but we hope to have enough funding to be able to have a brainstorming session the next Saturday morning about the next 10 or 20 years in the study and the pursuit of knowledge as regards to food. So now I will begin to shut up. Let's begin by welcoming the panel. We need the worms. Come on. We do have an extraordinary collection of people here today, and I want to start with Marcus Samuelsson. As I told you, our conversation not so long ago was part of the stimulation of our little brains that caused us to be gathering today. Marcus actually has a new book called The Soul of New Cuisine. The Soul of a New Cuisine. Sorry, I want to get this right. The publisher will hit me. A discovery of the foods and flavors of Africa. And it's interesting because Marcus is coming to this as an accomplished chef, well known by Time Out magazine as a master of Swedish cooking. He is the chef proprietor of Aquavit, as well as the mastermind behind a wonderful village restaurant called August, and a rather brilliant hotel-based restaurant called Ringo, which is Japanese for apple, as in the big. And so let's welcome Marcus Samuelsson, please. So Marcus, I think it would be great for you to do two things for us. To begin with, tell us a little bit about your challenges, your concerns about that piece on April 5th of 2006 called Black Chefs Struggle for the Top, and what you felt was perhaps useful about it and what you felt was challenging, and then go on to tell us a little bit about how you came to do this book.
Well, regarding the piece, I think we all read New York Times, and I think the Wednesday section is not just important for people here in New York, but my colleagues goes all the way out to Europe and Sweden, and they follow what happens in New York in the Wednesday section in the New York Times too. So I knew that if you touch this topic regarding color and restaurants and high-end restaurant and fine dining, New York Times, I feel, had to set the tone and the standard very much so. And once it's been touched there's not a lot of other pieces. There's sort of the pod of all the other pieces that's going to come out of that. And I was asked to participate in the piece about a month, in January last year. And I had several discussions with Michael Ruman about it, and I told him several people I felt they should participate in the piece, and Jessica is one of them, and Leah Chase. I said you have to start with Leah. You have to start with Leah Chase in New Orleans, and you should talk to Jessica. And you should talk to people like Bernard, Emerald Chef Bernard, and a lot of people in the industry, and about 15 people. I think if you've done that, then at least you would have a nationwide, broad idea about the field, the playing field, and back and forth, and I hung up and left with that they will do so, and then when I see the big piece about it, and the reference point of the people that they reference to this was Jean-Georges, Tom Colicchio, and Jacques Papin, which all three very good friends of mine and very accomplished people. But I felt it was a little bit like checking for extra virgin olive oil or something like that. It was not either. I think did Jean-Georges, Jacques, or Tom any justice, because their answers were very there was like answering some completely different thing, and I was very upset about, hey, here I trusted you to talk about this, and so I called Kathleen McElroy, which was the edit, which was the boss of the then was the boss for Dine In, Dine Out section. And I was very upset, and I had a meeting with her, and this was not at all what I felt the article should be about. And she was very apologetic and all of these things. But we, like anything, everything's an opportunity or a problem. And I think that that was really the kickoff idea for me, that I would like to participate in this in a little bit. I have to do something more. We have to partner with somebody. We need to do a yearly event. We need to talk to people about this. We need to educate people about this. And there's so many different topics about this, And I said, people of color has always been cooking, always. And before it was such a thing called fine dining. And I just think there's so many layers to this that if the Times would have been committed to this topic and maybe once a month talked about it, then that article would have made sense, because then you can come back at it and have several of these articles over the year interjected and sort of developing some type of a base and understanding for it. But since that was a one-off, then that just doesn't. I just didn't really think. I felt it was a little bit. I just didn't cover the topic at all.
So we're going to be looking to the monthly column in the New York Times. Either that or we'll take a full-page ad if Jeffrey Chodorow will let us have a piece of his pen. All right, and so before we go on, Marcus, tell us a little bit about if it does or doesn't relate to that book that you've just got out.
Well, the book came from several different experiences. In 98, I was asked by Ruth Reichel to go to Ethiopia to cook and write about Ethiopian food. And a couple of months after the article was out, I got enormous amount of letters, and Gourmet got an enormous amount of letters about the piece. And I said to myself, well, maybe there's something larger here. Maybe I should actually write a book about it. And I started to go to the Barnes & Noble's, Borders, the big stores, and there was basically the Time Life series about books from Africa. That I think the book came out 1950.
Yeah.
And then there were Jessica's fantastic books that are all, whether it's Brazilian or whether it relates to, always related back to the African American experience, and they're incredible inspirational books. And I feel like Jessica was a big inspiration for me doing this book. But I also felt like I'm a chef. I wanted to have, from a little bit different point of view, how I want to sort of explain about my cooking style and what I've experienced, my memories and what I've seen. So the first thing I say in the book is that you can't make a book about Africa. You can't do a book about a continent that's 900 million people deep and diverse and ethnic groups and also. But this talks a little bit where Africa got the inspiration from, in certain places as far as Indonesia, Malaysia, India, where Africa gave Persia, where Africa gave inspiration and influences to, Sardinia, Spain, Bahia, all of the Caribbean islands and the southern states of America. And where Africa is today. For me, it was very important to show people that Africa is not this place where it's war, AIDS, or famine. That Africa has a rich middle class in terms of culture, and an African family is no different than an American family in terms of their goals and objectives. An African family, most likely, people don't eat alone. People eat together. They have dinner together. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from Africa too. And my Ethiopian family always says me every time I go back to Ethiopia. They're like, "There's no food in New York. You should stay here in Ethiopia." So there's, And the last thing was that I also wanted Africans to see that food. What you have in Europe is German families can cook Italian meals because Italian food is available everywhere. A Moroccan family is not cooking Ethiopian food on a Wednesday and Nigerian food on a Thursday, the way we have the luxury to either do or experience here. Because tourism as such doesn't necessarily exist in the same way. And traveling and just business travel and so on. So I wanted Africans in general to be able to see themselves in this food and also be proud about how beautiful it could be laid out, and also learn about what else is going on in the continent. Oh, I didn't know Malay cooking is in Durban. I didn't know that Chepougen is in Senegal, came from Senegal, and this is the reason why we have. So there's many talking points conversation that I want people to sort of create, and also get American middle-class families just to talk to their kids about experience Africa in a different way than just war, AIDS, famine, and all these things, and cook from Africa, just the way you cook from Italy, just the way you cook from Spain today. So those were all the reasons.
Good start. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. All right. Next is one of the sources that Marcus made reference to. Jessica Harris, for me, is many things, and all of them are amusing and smart. A longtime professor at Queens College, but also one of the more lively elements of Mario Batali's sometimes television career. If you've ever seen her kibitzing on his show, it was worth the reruns. She's got a new book coming out called The Martha's Vineyard Table in May. And, of course, a lot of us know her best for Beyond Gumbo, Creole fusion food from the Atlantic Rim, and other books. She has 8 altogether. She's also one of the founders of the Southern Foodways Alliance. and constant commentator on whatever. Jessica, welcome, Jessica Harris. Jessica, I know you're not shy about these things, but I would like you to talk to us a little bit to begin with about what color means for you. About, yeah, how does that feel? And feel free to comment on a little bit of where Marcus has started the conversation. And I guess we may as well get this out of the way. Maybe a little bit on Alan Richman's article, I believe it's called, in some publication in the last year that questioned the reality or the origins of Cajun and Creole cooking. Jessica.
Hi. Okay. I'm beginning to suspect invariably invited to places because I'm cranky. And I'm cranky about a lot of things. Before I get on with the color crankiness, I'd like to start with the New York Times crankiness.
Oh, please.
And go from there. Can't say that they didn't speak to me. I get an awful lot of calls, and usually I'm in the middle of a nap and wake up and somebody wants to know something about, I read your, or I found, and there was, and can you tell me? And I sometimes answer, and sometimes I'm even crankier than I am now. But with regard to that, I think one of the things is my people don't read the New York Times. It's not a basic building block, if you will, about our culinary reality. And we certainly don't define ourselves by the New York Times. That being said, I think one of the things that has happened is that we have become very media-oriented in terms of how we even look at food. Who are the great chefs in the country? Are they the ones who are best known? Are they the ones who have television shows? Are they the ones who have little tiny restaurants by the side of the road that are always full? What's the difference between a chef and a cook? Does it have to do with the definition? Because certainly Leah Chase, who has now been cited twice, would call herself a cook, not a chef. And she does call herself a cook. I think that a lot of that is very much part of the history of African Americans in food in not so much this hemisphere, although by extension certainly in this hemisphere, but absolutely in this country, in what a friend of mine rudely refers to as the United Statesian reality of the hemisphere, because we're all Americans from Canada to, all the way down at the bottom. That being said, I think that the whole question of African Americans and food in this country is a very thorny one, and a thorny one that we're certainly not going to resolve here in any way, shape, form, or size today. I think that the history of enslavement, I said the enslavement word, coupled with the fact that up until very recently, if not continuing until today, you could go into any major kitchen in any restaurant in the country and find not only African Americans in the up from the South definition of that, but people of color from the world, the hemisphere, doing most of the work. I mean, maybe not the final finishing, and maybe not that little gloss of sauce, but most of the prepping, chopping, sautéing, all of that is done by others. That other that is invisible to the culinary world, because the person who comes out and presents the plate is the person who comes out and presents the plate. And that person is usually not Marcus. With that in mind, I'm writing a new book, which is not the Martha's Vineyard Table. I'm doing a non-cookbook. So I'm doing a book called High on the Hog. It is to be a narrative history of African Americans in food. And the coda in the final chapter is Why So Few Celebrity Chefs? And hopefully maybe by 2010 I'll have a more complete answer, but I certainly think that those things are part of what feed into the question. The interesting thing is also owning a restaurant requires an extraordinary financial process. you have to have either be independently wealthy and living on your income, and even then, or have a lot of backers. You certainly have to have a financial record of great ilk. Talented chefs don't necessarily have that. Talented African American chefs don't necessarily have that. The whole question that you raised about how this happens, who goes to school, who goes to culinary school, who starts out as an apprenticeship. Talented African American chefs may not have had that ability. I know that there are infinite numbers, well, not maybe infinite, but increasing numbers of programs that are offered to talented people. However, the question is finding those talented people. And when it gets to a point where, I teach at Queens College. If you were Italian, you were a minority at Queens College. Okay? And eligible for the same things that African Americans are eligible for. What happens when you try to talk about African Americans? We are a dying breed, my dear. We may no longer exist in another 20 or 30 years. I think that all of those things become a part of the new reality of what the new United States is. This may be a debate we don't have in 50 years. It may be a debate we don't have for any number of reasons. First of all, because the minority may have become the majority. But certainly I think that the minority itself is, in its mixing and mingling, going to become so increasingly diverse that if the matrix culture is not firmly established, it will be subsumed. Okay. Have I depressed you enough?
No.
I've certainly depressed myself. I had no idea I was going to say that. That being said, I was also at that Ebony event. I don't know that we saw each other. And by the way, that TV show was Sarah Moulton, not Mario.
Oh. No wonder I noticed you so much.
Yeah. Because we were doing our Mutt and Jeff thing.
Yeah.
But I just recently pulled that out for some other work that I was doing and looked at the chefs. And the thing that was interesting about most of the chefs who were there was they were not chefs of freestanding restaurants. They were chefs of restaurants and hotels. They were chefs in other kinds of organizations. The majority of the women were caterers. And most of them, in fact, were not caterers. They were pastry chefs. There are an enormous number of African American women who have in the past, historically, and who continue to the present to make extra money or their money by catering sweets. The famous red velvet cake that everybody thinks is African American, that is not historically. Okay, all of those things are still parts of a means to an end and a way to live. Another chapter in the book is called Food for Freedom. It goes back to the Praline ladies and the Kala ladies and the market women of West Africa, and you can trace a line, and it's usually women in that sense who take that route. The men have a harder time, as you alluded to yourself when you talked about finding that independent chef who had gone the non-traditional route, and you didn't even add the definer of color. So I guess in the immortal words of Forrest Gump, that's all I got to say about that. About my new book,
Okay.
Martha's Vineyard Table, there is a group of African Americans who have been summering on the vineyard for probably the better part of 100 years now. I come to them not quite that 100, but I've been summering on the vineyard for the past 50. It's a book about a place that I love. It's kind of a heart book in the sense that it talks about the kaleidoscopic Martha's Vineyard that nobody sees. There are Brazilians on Martha's Vineyard. There are Jamaicans on Martha's Vineyard. There's certainly an African American community. There are multiple types of Portuguese-speaking people. People from Madeira, the original Portuguese who came with the whalers, who were joined subsequently by the Cape Verdeans, who were then joined by the Brazilians who found a place where they could find Portuguese culture. Jamaicans originally came as migrant workers, have settled, now do incredible amounts of work in all aspects of the island. The African Americans, multiple generations. I mean, if I had children, they would be third or fourth generation of my family to have summered on the Vineyard. Your, old line Yankees who are still there in all of their splendor and glory. There is a Wampanoag reservation at Aquina on one end of the island. It is this extraordinary, diverse place, and we hear about, Bill and Hill and all of their friends, and other folks go and have gone. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to go, but we may be another dying breed as that stuff gets more and more expensive. And I'm not going to depress you again, so I am through now.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. And actually, we'll save the discussion about the Creole Cajun thing for the entire panel when we open up altogether. The next gentleman on the panel actually has a wonderful, wonderful restaurant in Atlanta called Watershed. But more important, he recently introduced Al Roker to lard. And Al was pretty darn pleased, let me just tell you. Scott Peacock is probably best known to us here for his co-authoring of A Gift of Southern Cooking with the late and great Edna Lewis, and his partnering with her in a unique fashion. Please welcome Scott Peacock. So, Scott, you had a unique, and you have had, and you continue to have a unique perspective and experience in Atlanta in the forms of the expression of Southern cooking and history. And you worked with probably the best known restaurant and chef and cook, certainly in New York from the 20th century and beyond, Ms. Lewis. And you have had a unique perspective because of your collaboration. Tell us a little bit about what that's meant for Paleface, and a little bit about, because I have to say it's timely, the notion that while you have perfected what Ms. Lewis considered to be a quintessential fried chicken recipe, we're told in print that it was good, but it wasn't black. Please welcome Scott Peacock. Say a few words, Scott. We dare you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Wolf. Well, I think it's the most fascinating and complex topic, and hard to get a grasp on this perspective. I'll start with the chicken. You know, that was just one person being cute, I think. I mean, calling it not black, but I think that's a very good question. I mean, the chicken that I've become known for is really a synthesis. We have on Tuesday nights in Atlanta fried chicken night, and it's pan-fried chicken. There's a finite amount of it, and it's a zoo. And I would say just stay away. I mean, I try to. I mean, it's a nightmare. And the recipe for the chicken is straight out of the book, and it's a synthesis of it's a very good expression, actually, of the relationship, the friendship with Miss Lewis, because it's this combining of two different techniques of cooking chicken. Where I'm from in Alabama, people, black and white, traditionally either soak their chicken overnight in salt water or buttermilk, and then maybe put in an egg wash or dredge it in flour and fry it up. And I think that's fairly common in a lot of places. The thing that Miss Lewis brought to this was this amazing recipe for this fat that we fry the chicken in, which was a combination of lard and sweet butter and bits of country ham. I mean, to me, that country ham part being especially Virginian, where she was from, and grew up in this settlement founded by freed slaves. So in working this out and trying to come up with a chicken aid for a cookbook and also for a restaurant, it was trying out those elements of that, and I'm being sort of an excessive person, and thought, well, if a bath in buttermilk is good, then a bath in buttermilk and salt would be better, and so that's the end result. So the article that you're referring to was something in the local paper, and where they were just talking about the fuss over fried chicken because this chicken nut has become sort of a phenomenon. It's been written about in the Times and lots of other places. So someone said, well, this is good chicken, but it's not black people's chicken. And I don't really know how to respond. I guess what I would respond to that would say, well, what black people's chicken? Because that's the part that's interesting to me is maybe it's not, this woman was black, and maybe it's not her chicken, but there are many, I think any time that you say of the South is not one place, you know, it's many places within an area, and there are many people, and there are many black people within a range, and, you know, growing up in Alabama where I did, I mean, it's complete. Well, to grow up in America, I mean, it's completely influenced by black culture. I mean, we wouldn't have Elvis Presley if there weren't black culture, and so it's a complex and fascinating subject for me. I mean, and I don't think I think maybe Jessica could speak more to that in a moment, but I think that we often don't even know where things come from. And I was thinking earlier today and talking with a friend. I spend as much time in New York as I can, and about 10 years ago I came here with Miss Lewis to start work on a book, and I suddenly had this sense of being Southern, or what it meant to be Southern. And in the South, on New Year's Day, you have greens, and you have black-eyed peas, and you have some rich cut of pork. I mean, it's essential, and if you don't, you're courting disaster. You know, that's the idea. I mean, you eat greens because they bring you wealth. They represent money, and folded money, exactly. And the black-eyed peas represent coinage, or, you know, money, and then the richness of the pork. And there are different people who give slightly different interpretations, different aspects of this. So my whole life, I've eaten that on New Year's Day, and I've not given that much credence to it. I never ever thought about, you'll hear stories about Hoppin' John being this limp and crippled man in Charleston, et cetera, et cetera. Hoppin' John being a name for a dish of rice and peas. But I never thought much about those origins. So I came north, spent the summer here, and New Year's Day was approaching, and suddenly I realized I probably wasn't going to go anywhere else to find those things to eat in Greenwich Village, and that I should, but I felt a sense of dread, you know, that I had better come up with this, exactly. So, and I had lots of, you know, Southern expatriate friends that live here in the city, and I care about them as well. And so I had this idea that what I had to do was I had to have this dish to eat because that's who I am, and because I am afraid of what will happen if I don't. And I had to share this with my friends as well. So I couldn't find mason jars. I couldn't get everyone to come together because they were still drinking, but it was very important. I was talking to Miss Lewis about this, and I couldn't find mason jars at that time in Virginia, but I did find some inexpensive brand of applesauce, and so I bought up lots of little jars and emptied it out and sterilized them. And then I made black-eyed peas, and I made greens with rich pork in it and some cornbread, and I packed up these jars, and then I went and got Miss Lewis, and we went around the city delivering these little jars of greens and black-eyed peas to these hungover Southerners throughout the city. So, I was only recently not hungover, but and so then later my host family, where I was staying at their home on Colt Street, they had no idea about this, and I realized that people here, aside from nursing hangovers, had no real traditions about on New Year's Day, which was sort of surprising to me. I assumed the world did this. And so they had no clue, and I became very fascinated and started talking to people, anyone who would listen, which is a limited number actually, but anyway, and what was fascinating to me was what I discovered was that while my friends who were non-Southerners had no idea what I was talking about, they had two acquaintances, a Jamaican friend and one from Trinidad. And they both knew exactly what I was talking about. And maybe in different variations, but this idea of traditions of eating certain things on New Year's Day. And so to me that was quite a revelation, and I saw I began to look then and think and examine more about these influences. And of course there are many, I mean, through foodstuffs and much more. But I don't know that that's even remotely answering your question. But
I think
that
it
was-
does. You know, listening to these three wonderful people, I'm thinking of Alice Waters. And I'm thinking of Alice because Alice always talks about other dimensions that have to do with aesthetics. She always talks about the content being important and the subject being important and the direction being important and the revelation. But the sounds of these people's voices have been absolutely amazing to me. And I'm glad I'm saying it now because otherwise they'd throw things at me or get upset with me. I mean, it's extraordinary, the aesthetic quality of the sounds of personal voices when discussing some of these things. Now we have another voice to join the fray. Krishnendu Ray, or K. Ray as we like to call him, at the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health, is a sociologist and not from around here, as you may notice. His book, The Migrant's Table, Meals and Memories in Bengal American Households, is just kind of a kicking off point for the topic. Please welcome Krishnendu Ray, please. Krishnendu, so you've been listening to this. You're the new fella in town, and you see this from a very different perspective, not only of culture and history, but color. Say a word.
It's,
Whatever you want.
No, it's absolutely. My job here is to kind of provide footnotes affirming what has been said. So I'll start off with that. A couple of things. One is I'm a new American as an immigrant, whom you will also find in all those kitchens. And so I'm coming at it from the experience of a new immigrant who also is astonishingly lucky to be placed as a professor at NYU and not be working so hard in the kitchen. And I've taught at the culinary, and now I'm here, and so I'm looking. Most of my work is historically informed sociology, and I'm working on my next project, which is called Immigrant Cooks and Ethnic Tastes. And I'll quarrel with you saying why ethnic is in fact quite a useful category,
Okay.
as Scott pointed out, because it's about relationship. I define ethnic food as other people's food.
Okay.
And that, of course, immediately poses the question, who's the self?
Right.
Which is precisely the point of ethnic food. It, in fact, and if you look at restaurant kitchens, and this is, I was fascinated. On October 2nd, 1851, I'll give you a couple of examples. 1851, a correspondent of the Essex Freeman, published in Salem, Massachusetts, visited an escaped slave in Montreal. And I quote, engaged in keeping restaurant in Notre Dame Street. And the Frederick Douglass paper, published in Rochester, New York, another black newspaper, on December 14th, 1855, noted the unfairness when, and I quote, a wealthy San Domingo coffee dealer, a man of color, was last week denied a cup of coffee in a restaurant in Boston, while a week earlier, a jet black envoy from San Domingo was accredited to the court of St. James, it noted. And on February 9th, 1856, the provincial freeman from Chatham, Canada West, quoted another black newspaper in condemning an attempted kidnapping of a runaway in the following words, and I quote, many of our readers will no doubt recollect hearing of the attempt made by some scoundrel in the southern states following the vile business of a slave catcher to bribe the chief of police of Montreal to aid in enticing to the other side some unfortunate chattel escaped from bondage, Mrs. Sylvia Young, a colored woman, now residing with Mr. Thomas of the Shakespeare Restaurant, Stafford, was formerly the property of a lady is italicized, of the name of Dustin. Mrs. Young is a clever cook, and in the South, where such property is an article of merchandise, would have sold for a large sum of money, end quote. Why I give you these three quotes is, as a new American trying to re-educate myself about American history and my place in it, I was amazed when I looked at the historical literature, including Jessica's work, so much reference to escaped slaves in restaurants. And which, of course, if you think about it, doesn't surprise you, which is also the same reason why you find immigrants in restaurants, which is a cultural capital that you already have, where you don't need that much money to make a living. You need a lot of money to make a fancy restaurant, but not to make a living. Of course, so I went back and looked at the census figures. From the American census has identified occupations since the 1850s. And there's obviously a strong correlation between foreign birth and occupations. Let me give you 4 instances of maybe 3 instances. 1850 census in New York City area. 70% of employees of hotels and restaurants and 80% of hotel keepers were foreign born in 1850. Mostly of Irish and German heritage, and at that point of time, ethnic. And they've lost their ethnic capacity because they've lost their otherness in a sense, subsequently, subsumed in a largely white text. Where in a context where about a third of the labor force was foreign born. 50 years later, 1900 census, 63% of employees of hotels and restaurants in New York City were foreign born, mostly Irish at about 22% and German at about 16%. And 65% of hotel keepers were foreign born, mostly German, followed by the Irish and English born. Restaurant keepers, which shows up for the first time any substantial numbers in 1900, were 67% foreign born, Germans leading it at about 27%, followed by Austrians at about 17%, Russians at 10%, and Italians at about 7%. At a time when foreign born in New York City were about 50% of the population, right? Almost like right now, as we had in 1900, about 100 years ago, it's almost the same ratios. By the 1950 census, when the immigrant wave had in fact subsided, about 64% cooks in restaurants were foreign born. Still, Italians now replacing others at the top, constituting about 8% of cooks, followed by Greeks, then the Chinese, now the Germans were slipping down the scale in terms of just density because of the places from which immigration was happening. In the 2000 census, the last one, 64% of restaurant workers in New York City, or even more dramatically, 75% of cooks continued to be foreign born, which always is a sign of ethnicity, is a carrier of ethnicity, of this otherness, in its complex, mixed way that works, that may or may not always work with race, for instance, in terms of its correspondence. And of course, the leading regions of nativity were now Mexico and the various nations of Central America, the Caribbean basin, South America, China, and of course the old Soviet Union. In general, if you look at all the occupations from, say, 1850, first-time occupations identified, to, say, 2000, while food industry-related occupations have been numerically dominated, overwhelmingly dominated, as I pointed out, by foreign-born, members of the clergy, lawyers, school teachers, government officials, and physicians are almost 90, 92, 95% native-born. One thing has changed out of this list. Clergy, lawyers, school teachers, government officials continue to be heavily native-born. Physicians are peculiarly now overrepresented as foreign-born for the first time in the American occupational structure. You have this bifurcated immigration, where you have as likely to run into an Indian doctor in a hospital as a Mexican cook in a restaurant, which raises, of course, interesting questions about how this notion of self and other and occupational stratification happens. So let me just finish off by saying, as the example of Irish and German, which is itself quite an interesting story, I think ethnic food is a useful category if we define it as other people's food, and we know that this other people is a complex category because that reflects back immediately on who's the self. And that has changing connotations and orientations. And then, as Scott pointed out, of course, in any of these things, there will be always complaints about authenticity and sellout. But at some level, all conversations are also acts of translation. All conversations are acts of translation. And especially between socially congealed groups, races, nations, ethnicities. And any conversation with the other is partly a betrayal, but also makes it possible to, in some ways, that tension of that conversation is precisely what it means, I think, to be an American. At least that's how I understand as a new immigrant.
That's wonderful. Thank you. All right. He always does that. As a first-generation American myself, I want to begin with the ethnic discussion. The fact is that I do very much, for myself, want to continue to be the other. I don't want to be part of a group that includes Dick Cheney. and also the American, I am absolutely nomadically admitted by coastally American without question. So let's go down. And by the way, if you have your questions, you can pass them down now. And Tosca, if you would collect them, please. Let's start with Marcus. And you, obviously, I can't stop you with your other comments. Let's start with ethnic as a term, pro or con, or both.
I'm always confused about when people say ethnic and all. I mean, my perspective is really awkward. I feel like I have a case for not fitting in anywhere, so I decide to fit in everywhere. It's just my parents were white. My parents are white. My sister is half black, half white. My cousins are Koreans. My other cousins, they're Jewish. So when I'm in Sweden, I'm black. When I'm in Ethiopia, I'm white. When I'm in New York, I belong. So ethnic for me, it's very confusing. I sense that people always, no matter what region, no matter what ethnic group you belong to, always likes to look or taste or feel people that look like themselves, but always most of the time stays open for new culture. So my grandmother in Sweden came from the south, where they were cooking one style, and my grandfather on my father's side came from the water, where they were cooking one way. So they're ethnically, race-wise, the same, but language-wise talk completely different, and the starting points of life were completely different, and the taste buds was completely different. So that, for me, is diversity within the same country, the same race, and what people will just say, oh, they're Swedes. So I have ethnic, and then you go to Ethiopia, where my family lives in a tribe where they're of Amhara tribe, but they live in the Oromo region tribes, which is ethnically. So here there would be black folks, or there would be Ethiopians, if you would go deeper. But even in Ethiopia, they speak a completely different language. They're a minority within them where they live. So their ethnic means completely different. But it's food-wise, music, everything that counts in terms of culture, they are different. They are the minority.
So in America, how do you find the usefulness of the term ethnic food?
I like to. I think it's interesting, like, to find a culture and a core culture. Like, for example, Floyd Cardos from India. Okay, it's a big country, but he explained for me, no, I'm from the south, where we're Catholic, and therefore we have pork in our food, and so then I know about exactly what type of experience, and that's why his food is
The way it is.
the way it is, and it's a natural extension of him and his grandmother and his mother and so on. So I think it's great here because there's so many different ethnic groups, and they all taste and smell different, and they can all taste and smell and work together. Great.
Jessica?
Wow. I'm not even sure where to start. I think one of the things that amazes me about myself is I am, by certainly background and training, probably one of the most diverse people you will ever know. My elementary schooling was at the UN school, and for my entire upbringing from pre-K through, up till high school, I was way more worried about being an American and not having a native costume than about being black. Yet somehow or other I have become a rather passionate advocate for blackness in the sense of United Statesian African Americanness, in the sense that, as K-Ray said, the whole notion of socially congealed and what happens. One of the interesting things about the listing of who was other in all of those years is, well, up until the recent ones, is all of those others have now become, by dint of being in America, white. With a hyphen, but white. I have, my hyphen is Africa, which is so remote in my personal history that it takes me at least 6 generations plus to get there. I don't have a place to be other than, by definition, vis-a-vis all of the other ethnicities who have become white, thereby making me whatever that other is. I think that is one of the reasons I have become so territorial about African American food, because it's that. There is no hyphen. You know, it's African American because that's what we're now calling it. We've been colored, Negro. There's been a whole lot of stuff we've been. I think that in terms of that is the thing that is, in some strange way, the uniqueness about the longevity of our being here, before we even get into the manner in which that longevity occurred, which is enslavement. I think that that's what creates the thorn for me. When I say ethnic, I'm not referring to myself. And when other people say ethnic, I don't think they're referring to me either, in a strange way. I think that they're referring to me when they say soul food, which is a whole nother debate. And about the greens. If I had known you, you could have come to my house. Because the bottom line is there is this thing called the South in the North.
Yes.
And we don't really talk about it. And most white Northerners have, I didn't become a Northerner until I went South. I'm born and raised in New York City, so I don't know from the South. In the sense that I went South as a full-grown adult, or as I would say, a full-grown, way-grown adult. But I realized when I went South that I had been raised extraordinarily in a Southern world. I'm not going to let New Year's Day go by without having greens for folding money, black-eyed peas and rice for luck, and some big old piece of pork, preferably with crackling. And when I grew up, I liked the idea of the ham, because when I grew up, we didn't have the little ham to go in the grease you fry the chicken in. That was what coffee cans were for. It was for the bacon drippings that lived on the back of the stove. And when you went to fry anything, you fried them in the bacon drippings. Lard was for biscuits. Lard was, if you didn't have enough bacon drippings, you supplemented. But the bacon drippings were what added that flavor. Now, when we get onto the subject of chicken, and I have been unfortunately memorialized in the New York Times in a great and heroic battle of fried chicken. I don't know if you were there, that I had at the Southern Foodways Alliance with Damon Lee Fowler, where we were toe-to-toe and sort of clenched of teeth and tight of jaw about its origins. But I have loosened and somewhat matured with age, somewhat, only somewhat, and come to the fact that again, I keep quoting from this book because I guess it's there are dredgers and there are batterers. And I guess there are overnight soakers. I may have to add a third category. And whether you're a dredger or a batter or an overnight soaker may have more to do with where you're from than with how you look. Hence the chapter in the book entitled, Your Greens Ain't Like Mine, or Are They? Because I think that we have an awful lot of commonness that we ignore because of our traditional definitions.
Great. Scott, ethnic, friend or foe?
Well, I just say I'm a dredger and a patter because I dredge within
What is
pat
that overnight
just as
soak?
much flour off as I can. So there's just this rumor of flour. I think that for me, and that's just personal preference. That's not even based on what I grew up with. That's what I found too. You know, and maybe it is because I am not considered ethnic that it's interesting. I'm undecided. I'm not a friend or foe of that word. I think what's much more fascinating to me is, I think it's that same idea that we've already said, that you say the South. Well, what is the South? Because it's this huge area that spans a large distance. And for me, I grew up in Alabama with absolutely no interest aside from just, seeing how much of that Southern food I could put in my mouth. I wasn't, I wanted to be Julia Child. I wanted to do real cooking, and then, and it was a journey for me, and in meeting Miss Lewis that I had this really sort of an epiphany in New York City, actually, and talking with her and reading The Taste of Country Cooking and this gorgeous book that she wrote describing a year in her childhood in Virginia in this settlement founded by freed slaves. And I recognized so much of the food because it was familiar to me, but then there were dishes like blancmange and gooseberries and black raspberries and liver pudding, things that were completely exotic to me, and that I think would not be that was her Black experience, and I don't think blancmange was a part of the Black community in Hartford, Alabama. So that's what I find interesting, and what Marcus was touching on, with his heritage. I think that is what's fascinating. I think that's the danger in when you start to maybe use a word like ethnic, that it implies that all people in this group do this, eat this way, cook this way, taste this way. And that was my point about, saying this is not Black people's fried chicken. It was like, which...
Well, all right, so I have these two questions, two very good questions that are kind of on either side, and Christina, maybe you can start with this. I remember working with a hotel in Los Angeles overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and the French chef who was in charge of it was serving quesadillas in the bar, and it was terrible. I mean, the salsa was just like the frightening, And he said, I couldn't, so I walked into the kitchen, I said, Chef, come with me. Anybody in here know how to make salsa? It was a kitchen in Southern California. You want my mother's? You want my brother? You want my father? We had 9 kinds of salsa in 8 seconds. So this very good question. Coexisting in kitchens with other cultures, has it changed your personal viewpoint, methodology, cooking style? Or have you remained Julia Child impervious? Any of you, please.
The two people who are in kitchens.
Yeah, kitchen.
Absolutely. I think diversity is so important in the kitchen for the chef for many, 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 many reasons that the chef, if you're not open-minded to it, you don't even understand. Coming from French school training, it didn't exist any in the 3-star and Michelin restaurant where I worked in. On the top of it, there didn't exist any diversity, but once you scraped on it, it was lots of diversity. There were Japanese cooks, there were cooks from all over the world, but it's just our voices were not supposed to be heard, and that's fine, that was the training. And coming to America, where all the cooks are in my kitchen are from all over the world, and some are actually Americans, but they are the pure Americans, are the minority. The rest are from Korea or from Brazil or from Israel or from Sweden or from the Caribbean, wherever they're. And staff meal is one of these incredible things that happens in the restaurants, and you just cannot be. And staff meal is one of these things where the chef very often tests the cooks, and I was tested that way. I had to cook for Georges Blanc, first with his dog, and then then the staff, and then on the line. So staff meal is the way where I test, and the best cooks are very often the dishwashers, because they grew up with home-cooked food and real sense of taste. And you cannot be a chef today in New York City or in America, I think, and not reflect on your staff. And so the ethnic food or the diversity of my staff always inspires me. And I know it's the new journey. It's like definitely the journey. But it ultimately comes back to, are you intrigued? Do you ask questions about your surroundings, or do you not? Or is it all about you and your experience and what you want to portray? Or do you leave open-minded for that room? And if you do, then your staff's going to be a very important part of that, and will change the way you cook.
It's interesting. Thomas Keller has a new restaurant that I think should be renamed. It's now called Ad Hoc. I think it should be called Staff Meal. It really is very much like the best of what you're talking about. I'm going to give it to you, Scott, but I want you to do it in two pieces, because the other question that's so good is, in responding to this, and at the same time, I hear some preservation-minded folks who want to stick their hands deeply into tradition and history. What is the best way to record and to preserve the culinary traditions of those with culinary history to share? So what are the influences that happen in your kitchen? And also at the same time, then Krishnendu, you comment a little bit. What is the best way to hold on to stuff that we'd like to hold on to?
Well,
in this melting pot?
I would agree with Marcus, what he said about that, the dishwashers being the best cooks. Watershed has been open for over 8 years now, and the couple, it functions quite well with me being here in New York today. But there's a couple, a Mexican couple, husband and wife, who started from day one. They're the only people besides myself who have been there from the very beginning in that restaurant. And they were dishwashers. And they are, in my opinion, the heart and soul of Watershed. I mean, she's the one who fries this famous fried chicken, in skillets on top of the stove on Tuesdays. And they're the ones that make the mayonnaise every day and the pimento cheese and all the fundamental things. And what I find, I mean, I would often, I believe with all my heart that a large part of this is because they did grow up cooking and growing food and eating food, and they know how to use salt and pepper, which I think is about the most important part of cooking, period. And they didn't grow up, opening packages and microwaving and, such access to all convenience food and shortcuts. And they grew up, I think, closer in this situation for them in particular, closer to the land, and they have a sense of appreciation and gratitude that we don't always have as a culture here. Sadly, we're such a culture of waste, and so I would agree that has been I will often turn in that direction.
Krishnendu?
A couple of things. One is my work on immigrants is you preserve things, I guess, by what immigrants' way they do it. My work was on domestic cookery, and immigrants classically, in a sense, I was amazed. It showed breakfast is completely open to the American marketplace, as in cereal, industrialized cereal. That is the first meal completely in the immigrant self-conception, Americanized. Lunch, mostly marketplace, but as breakfast and lunch gets in their conception more, I'm including me and them, Americanized, there is almost a rebound back into tradition at dinner. Bengali Americans eat more fish more often and rice more often in the US than in Calcutta. And if you just do quantity of fish, or of course, which is partly related to affluence, but often. So in some ways, we are all becoming the same. We are all also insistently becoming different simultaneously, I think, depending on what meal you look at. Sometimes people miss it because they look at one meal. They don't look at the cycle of the meal. And if you look at the cycle of the meal, there's an assertion of kind of a homogeneity, and there's also an assertion of difference. I think that's one level. I think at the second level is precisely the thing that sometimes gives us trouble, is where I think authentic food is going to be authentic, all within quotes, as academics always do. Ethnic food is going to be in the marketplace of fashion. We're seeing that. Is precisely because food is fashionable. And there is this rich conversation about what it is and what is authentic and what is inauthentic, and the quarrels about it. People are building useful walls around these things, from letting them dissipate, and then they are selling it to us. And we go and buy it, and which is precisely what in some ways linked to affluence and linked to urban living, linked to being professionals, is the capacity to buy tradition. And that is precisely what is modern, is that we can buy tradition.
And as we all know, when it comes to Thanksgiving, we all cook that turkey, even though it's done in a million different ways. Thank you all very much for these wonderful thoughts. Obviously, Obviously, this could be a 3-month retreat just to begin with, and that is our purpose here by gathering with all of you focused on these critical topics. These are things we could really dig into. I hope that you will dig into the wonderful food and the reception that comes from Cleaver & Company, a woman's business that's been organic, sustainable, and often free range, especially the carrots, for almost 20 years. And also enjoy some of the Sauvignon Blanc from the organic fields of Robert Mondavi Jr. Peter Mondavi Jr. You know, he wouldn't really mind. Thank you all for coming. See you in the gallery.